Imagine this. She had no denomination behind her, no wealthy donor, no theological training, no church building, and no name that anyone in Canada would have recognized. She had never preached a sermon. She had never led a congregation. She was, by every visible measure, no one. And yet, on a cold February morning in 1908, in a rented hall above a hardware store on a side street in Winnipeg, something happened to Beatrice Colquhoun that the people in that room could not explain for the rest of their lives. Some of them tried. Some of them wrote it down years later, when they were old and no longer cared if people believed them. What they all agreed on was this. Something entered the room that did not belong to the weather, or the week, or the ordinary turning of the world. But we are getting ahead of ourselves, because the story of Beatrice Colquhoun does not begin in Winnipeg. It begins much earlier, in a farmhouse outside of Guelph, Ontario, where a girl grew up believing that God was large and terrifying and mostly silent. Her father, Archibald Colquhoun, was a Scottish Presbyterian of the old school. He read scripture at the dinner table every evening before the food was passed. He did not raise his voice in worship. He did not clap his hands or weep or speak in ways that he felt were inappropriate to the majesty of a holy God. Faith in the Colquhoun household was a matter of discipline. You showed up, you sat still. You gave what was asked of you, and you did not expect God to come and sit beside you in the pew. Beatrice was the second of 5 children, and she was quiet in the way that quiet children sometimes are. Not because they have nothing to say, but because they have decided that no one is ready to hear it. She watched everything. She watched her father's face when he read the Psalms, and saw something flicker there that he would never have called emotion. She watched her mother kneel beside the bed each night, lips moving, eyes closed, and wondered what was being said in that private language between her mother and heaven. She was 7 years old when she first asked her mother what she prayed about. Her mother, whose name was Catherine, looked at her for a moment before answering. "I ask him to be near," she said. Beatrice thought about that for a long time. She asked him to be near, not to fix things, not to send rain or keep the harvest or heal the sick neighbor down the road, just to be near. That answer followed Beatrice for the rest of her life. She was not a child who had dramatic visions. She did not hear voices, or see lights, or wake in the night with the sense of a presence in the room. What she had was simpler and in many ways harder, a persistent low-grade ache, like a hunger she could not locate, that no amount of church attendance or Bible reading or good behavior seemed to satisfy. She went to the church her father attended. She sat through sermons that were long and careful and correct. She felt nothing. She assumed this was normal. She assumed this was what faith was, the discipline of continuing when nothing came back. She was 14 when her mother died. Catherine Colquhoun went in the spring, from a fever that moved too quickly for anyone to stop it. She was there on a Thursday and gone by Sunday, and the house became a different place almost immediately. Not louder or quieter, not obviously changed, but different in the way that a room is different when something essential has been removed from it. The way you notice the absence of a chair, not because you were always looking at it, but because the space where it was now catches the light wrong. Archibald did not speak about his grief. The children were fed and clothed and sent to school, and the farm continued. On Sunday they went to church. At dinner the scripture was still read, but something had locked inside her father that Beatrice did not know how to reach, and she stopped trying after a while, because every attempt felt like pressing on a bruise that neither of them wanted to name. She began reading the Bible on her own around this time, not out of piety, but out of something closer to desperation. She was looking for the thing her mother had known how to find. She was looking for the God her mother had spoken to in that private language beside the bed. She read for hours. She read the Psalms until she had half of them memorized. She read the Gospels slowly, going back over sentences she didn't understand. She read Acts, and then she read it again, and the second time through she stopped at the second chapter and sat very still for a long moment. Something happened to those people, she thought. Something happened that changed them, and no one has ever told me that it can happen to me. She folded the page down at the corner, which her father would have considered disrespectful to the book, and she went to bed and lay in the dark thinking about Pentecost. She was 19 when she left Guelph. Her father had remarried by then. A practical woman from the congregation named Irene, who was perfectly kind and with whom Beatrice had no real quarrel. But the house had become someone else's, and Beatrice had been quietly aware for some time that her future was not going to be found there. She went to Toronto first, then to Hamilton, working in households, doing the kind of labor that was available to young women of modest circumstances who had no profession and no connections. She cleaned, she cooked, she minded children. She saved what she could. She joined a holiness congregation in Hamilton because a woman at the house where she worked had told her about it, and because the description of the services. People who wept, who prayed aloud, who sometimes fell to their knees in the middle of a meeting, sounded closer to what she had been looking for than anything she had found in the careful, controlled Presbyterianism of her childhood. She was not disappointed exactly. There was more warmth in those rooms than in her father's church. There were people who prayed with genuine feeling, who spoke about God as though he was present rather than theoretical. She was glad to be among them. But the hunger did not go away. She could not have told you precisely what she was hungry for. She knew the language of it, the fullness of the Spirit, the baptism of fire. She had heard those phrases in the holiness meetings, had read about them in the pamphlets that circulated through those circles. But she had never experienced anything she would have called that. She had moments of warmth, moments of what she might have called comfort, evenings when the worship felt alive and real and close. But then the morning would come, ordinary and gray, and she would feel exactly as she always had, and she would wonder if she was missing something, or if the something she was looking for did not exist. She was 26 years old when she arrived in Winnipeg. She had come because of a letter from a woman named Margaret Thwaite, who ran a small mission house on Selkirk Avenue and who needed someone to help with the work. Beatrice had met Margaret at a conference in Hamilton the previous summer. Margaret was a large, unhurried woman with a face like someone who had been laughed at enough times that she had simply stopped caring whether you laughed. She believed in direct prayer, in feeding people before preaching to them, in the idea that the Holy Spirit was not a doctrine but a person, and that a person could be known. Beatrice had sat next to her at the closing session of the conference, and within 20 minutes had felt more seen than she had in years. She wrote Margaret a letter the following week. Margaret wrote back. 6 months later, Beatrice was on a train to Winnipeg with a single trunk and a Bible with a folded-down corner at Acts chapter 2. The mission house on Selkirk was a narrow 2-story building between a Chinese laundry and a barber shop, in a neighborhood that the respectable part of the city did not spend much time thinking about. The people who came to the mission were laborers, immigrants, women who had run out of other options, men who were working their way through a bottle of something and occasionally surfacing long enough to wonder if there was another way. Beatrice learned to cook large pots of soup. She learned to sit with people without filling the silence. She learned that the work of a mission was mostly the work of showing up, day after day, in a place that people knew they could find you. She prayed every morning, alone, before anyone else was awake. She had been doing this since Hamilton. She did not always feel anything when she prayed. She had come to accept this, the way you accept weather. You do not stop going outside because the sky is gray. But she continued to carry the question she had been carrying since she was 14 years old, reading Acts in her father's farmhouse. Something happened to those people. She had never let go of that sentence. She held it the way you hold a stone in your pocket that you have found somewhere meaningful. Not always thinking about it, but always aware that it is there. The meetings at the mission hall above the hardware store had been going for 3 weeks when Beatrice first attended one. The hall was rented on Thursday evenings by a group she had heard described variously as Pentecostalists or Apostolics, or by the more skeptical residents of Selkirk Avenue, as people who had gotten religion so hard they'd lost their minds. A minister named Percival Bain had come up from the American Midwest the previous autumn, carrying with him reports of meetings in Los Angeles and Kansas where things had happened that defied what most churchgoers considered the normal range of spiritual experience. People speaking in languages they had never learned, People healed of things that doctors had given up on. People who came into the meeting as one version of themselves and left as another. Margaret had heard Percival Bain speak at a church across town and had come home quieter than usual, which in Margaret's case was notable. She told Beatrice about it over tea the next morning. Carefully, the way you describe something that you are still deciding what to make of. She said she did not know what she believed about the languages, about the healings, about the more unusual manifestations. But she said that the man had prayed with a sincerity she could not dismiss, and that something in the room that evening had been different from anything she had previously experienced in 40 years of church-going. She thought Beatrice should come with her on Thursday. Beatrice went. The hall was not impressive. Wooden chairs in uneven rows, a pot-belly stove doing its best against the February cold, a lamp on a table at the front which was where Percival Bain stood when he spoke. He was younger than Beatrice had expected, perhaps 40, with the look of a man who had been outside in difficult weather for most of his life. He did not have the preacher's polish of the men she had heard at conferences and conventions. He spoke the way someone speaks when they have stopped caring about how they sound and started caring only about whether what they are saying is true. He spoke for perhaps 30 minutes. Beatrice could not have told you afterward what the text was. She could tell you that somewhere in those 30 minutes, the hunger she had been carrying since she was 14 years old, the hunger she had more or less made her peace with, had accepted as simply the condition of being herself. That hunger began to move. It became acute. It became nearly unbearable. She sat in her wooden chair with her hands folded in her lap and felt something pressing against the inside of her chest that she did not have a name for. When the speaking stopped and the prayer began, she closed her eyes. What happened next, she wrote about twice in her life. Once in a letter to Margaret, written the following morning, and once, 30 years later, in a small memoir that was privately printed and distributed among the mission communities she had worked with across the Canadian prairies. The two accounts differ slightly in detail, but agree on everything essential. She said that she became aware, in the dark behind her closed eyes, of what she could only describe as an increase in the room, as though something had entered, as though the air had changed its quality, not temperature, not pressure, but something she had no precise word for. She said she had the sensation of warmth, beginning at the crown of her head and moving through her, and she said that this warmth was not like physical warmth. It was interior, and it was not heat exactly, but something that heat was a clumsy approximation of. And then she began to speak. She did not know what she was saying. She was aware of her own voice, and aware that the words she was forming were not English or French or any language she knew. She was aware of this and found, to her own surprise, that she was not frightened. She felt, she wrote, the way a river feels when a dam is opened. The word she used was released. She felt released. She did not know how long it lasted. When she became aware of the room again, she realized that she was no longer sitting. She was on her knees on the floor. She did not remember getting there. The people nearest to her had moved back, not in alarm, or not only in alarm, but with a quality of attention she found difficult to describe. Several of them were on their knees as well, at a slight distance from her. One woman, Beatrice would learn later, had shielded her eyes with her hand. She said afterward that there had been something around Beatrice's head that she could not look at directly. She said it was not exactly light, or it was not any light she had a category for, and that it had seemed to come from something she could not see. A man named Bernard Lowes, who worked at the railway yard and had no history of religious sentiment, said that when he looked at Beatrice during those minutes, he had felt he was intruding. He said that somehow the space around her had felt private in a way that he could not explain, that whatever was happening was not public business, and that he had looked away out of something that was not politeness, but was related to it. He did not come back to the mission hall the following week. He came back the week after that, and the week after that, and he brought his brother, and he stayed. Beatrice did not, in the days and weeks that followed, become someone she was not. This is perhaps the thing about her story that is most worth sitting with, and the thing that is most easily lost when stories like hers get told by people who are interested primarily in the dramatic parts. She did not develop a platform. She did not begin holding meetings where she was the main attraction. She did not write books or travel the country or receive delegations from denominations wanting to understand what had happened to her. She went back to the mission on Selkirk Avenue and continued making soup. But something had changed, and the people who were around her most often were the first to notice it. Margaret noticed it. She said years later that Beatrice had always been the kind of person you were glad to be in a room with, but that after February 1908, she became the kind of person you found yourself moving toward without quite knowing why. That she had a quality of attention that made people feel that what they said mattered. That she prayed for people with a directness that was new. Not louder, not more dramatic, but more present, as though she was standing closer to something and was able to bring you with her. There were healings. Beatrice did not advertise them, did not particularly try to explain them, and tended to deflect when people asked about them. A young woman named Adelaide, who had been brought to the mission in a state of considerable physical distress after a miscarriage that the attending doctor had complicated, recovered in a way that the doctor, when he came back to check on her the following week, said he would not have predicted. He was a careful man, not inclined to extravagance of statement, and what he said was simply that he did not know what had happened. He said this to Margaret, and did not ask further questions. A man in the late stages of something that had begun in his lungs, spent 3 evenings in the mission sitting room while Beatrice read to him and occasionally prayed quietly in a corner. He did not recover. He died, as such men generally did, on a Tuesday in March. But his daughter, who had been present throughout, said that something in those last weeks had been different. That her father had become, in some way she could not account for, unafraid. She said that in all her life she had never seen her father without fear, and that watching it leave him, whatever that process was the most significant thing she had ever witnessed. She came to the Thursday meetings for the rest of that year. Beatrice moved to Edmonton in 1912, to Prince Albert in 1917, to a Cree community outside of Battleford in 1921, where she spent 11 years doing work that she herself described as mostly learning. She spoke with some frequency about her own ignorance, about the things she had assumed she understood and discovered she did not, about the moments when her faith had felt like something she was holding correctly and then turned out to be a door she was standing in front of, rather than opening. She corresponded regularly with Margaret until Margaret's death in 1929. The letters have been partially preserved. They are not the letters of someone who found what she was looking for in February 1908 and has been coasting ever since. They are the letters of a person in ongoing conversation with a God she finds by turns clear and baffling, near and far, unmistakable, and entirely absent. She writes in one of the later letters, "This is 1927, she is 45 years old, that she has come to believe that the event in the hall was not the destination, that she spent some years believing it was the destination, and that this belief had, in ways she was still working out, cost her something. That she had for a time held the experience more tightly than the one who gave it. That she had looked back at the room above the hardware store so often that she had occasionally stopped looking forward." She does not say what she lost in those years. But the next letter, written 2 months later, has a different quality to it. It is quieter. It is the letter of someone who has put something down. In Battleford, she lived with a family named McGregor for the first 3 years, and then in a small cabin of her own that she and an older man named Charlie built over the course of a summer and a half. She had a garden. She had a dog that she named Wentworth, for no reason she ever satisfactorily explained. She rose early every morning and prayed as she had since Hamilton, and on many mornings she felt nothing in particular, and on some mornings she felt something she still could not name. And on a few mornings, spread out across the years like stars across a very wide sky, she felt what she had felt in the hall above the hardware store, that interior warmth, that sense of release, that quality of a room that has been entered by something. She never stopped being hungry. She wrote that, clearly, in the memoir she published in 1938. She said she had once thought that the event in Winnipeg meant she would no longer be hungry, and she had been wrong, and being wrong about that had taken her some time to recover from. But she said that she had come to believe that the hunger was not a problem to be solved, that it was, perhaps, the correct relationship between a finite person and an infinite God, that the hunger kept you moving toward rather than settling for, and that settling for was the greater danger. She finished the memoir with a question, not an answer, a question. She asked the reader, and she was writing for the community she knew, for the people in those mission circles across the prairies who had known her in some cases for 30 years. She asked them, "What are you asking him for? Not what are you asking him to give you? What are you asking him to be?" She died in the winter of 1949 in Prince Albert at 67 years old. She had gone back there in 1937, after the years in Battleford, and had spent the last decade of her life in a small apartment above a laundromat, writing letters, receiving visitors, praying with whoever came, continuing the work that she had never really given a name to and had never stopped doing. There was no significant obituary. The Prince Albert Daily Herald ran 4 lines. She was buried in a church cemetery on the east side of town, in a grave that a small community of people maintained for years afterward, out of an attachment they would not have been able to fully explain to someone who hadn't known her. Bernard Lowes, the man from the railway yard in Winnipeg, who had looked away from her in the hall above the hardware store because the space around her felt private. He outlived her by 3 years. When someone eventually wrote a small account of that February evening in 1908, they tracked Bernard down in his retirement and asked him what he remembered. He was 81 by then, and his memory was unreliable on many things. But on this he was clear. He said he remembered looking at Beatrice Colquhoun on the floor of that hall and having the strong and immediate conviction that he was seeing something he was not entitled to see. Not because it was secret, because it was too large for looking at. He said the closest he could come to describing it was watching someone receive news that was too important for the room it was being received in. He said he had been a man who considered himself practical, who had not placed much weight on things he could not account for. He said that after that evening he remained a practical man in most respects. But he said that he had never again been able to dismiss what he couldn't account for. He said that Beatrice Colquhoun had, without saying a word to him, without ever knowing he was watching, taken a category of experience he had sealed off and left it permanently open. "I brought my brother the week after," he said. And then he was quiet for a moment. And then he said, "I brought him because I didn't know what else to do with what I'd seen." He brought his brother, and his brother brought his wife. And his wife brought a woman she worked with, who had been sick for a long time and was running out of reasons to try. And she came, and something happened to her too, in that small hall, in that cold winter, above a hardware store on a side street in Winnipeg. The hunger does not go away, but sometimes, in certain rooms, on certain evenings, it becomes something other than a lack. It becomes a direction. It becomes the thing that keeps you walking toward, rather than settling into the comfortable and the close enough. Beatrice Colquhoun walked toward until she had no more walking in her, and she finished the race hungry. But she never stopped running.